ESPN.com NFL Insider KC Joyner. He'll join us each and every Monday and Friday on the show to recap the action from Monday's games and to preview all the action for Sunday's games. Looking forward to another football season with the football scientist and ESPN.com senior NFL insider KC Joyner right here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline on 97.3 ESPN. And KC, last night the Eagles lost on a 3-run homer and a 2-run double, 5-0. But you've been around football a long time. The Super Bowl champions, have anything to worry about? Any concerns? Any panic? Or just another Week 3 preseason game in the NFL?
I think that they don't look at it. They know there are teams that want to win in the preseason. Don Shula back in the day, he really wanted to show get his team to win in the preseason because he thought it set the right tone. I don't think the Eagles look at the preseason that way. I think they view it as we're trying to look at different players and test them and get them ready and such. So wouldn't be worried. I was a little concerned, though, that Mike Wallace only got 2 targets. I kind of thought that this is supposed to be the game where he starts to show, hey, this is why I'm going to be one of the deep threats in his offense. But even that there could have been reasons for that. So that's the only thing that really stood out to me.
All right. You look at Nick Foles, and I don't know how much of the game. He was the national game last night, so you did maybe get a chance to watch him exclusively, but he did not play well. He has not played well at all during the preseason. He threw a couple bad picks, double coverage. When you look at Nick Foles, if he has to play, do you get concerned watching him in that preseason game?
I don't like what I see. He had the fumble, and he didn't look that good. I mean, you look at his numbers, you go 13 for 17, 127. I mean, I like the completion rate, but there's nothing vertical there, and that's, again, why I was a little I don't say concerned, but a little thrown off by not using Wallace more often vertically, because you're thinking that that's the one thing you're wanting to set up is the vertical game, because I'm not worried about their run blocking. I'm not worried about their ability to dink and dunk. I am worried about their ability to get downfield, because Jeffrey's a little banged up. In fact, the whole receiving corps is banged up. So Wallace, if he's going to be your go-to guy, last night was the game to do that, but Foles did look a bit rusty, so those are things that I would want them to be working on, is saying we need to make sure that Foles isn't starting to make mistakes like he has done at times in the past, and again, get the vertical game going, because they really have to get the vertical game going.
Now, one thing that seems to be noticeable is no RPOs. They're not really running that same offense that they ran with Nick Foles. Is that a sign that maybe Carson Wentz is going to be ready because they don't want to implement a different offense and then have to switch it back once Wentz is ready to go?
I would think so. I would think also that they don't want to run. I mean, the RPOs, there's certain, what you're doing with your RPOs. I think maybe there's other things either they don't want to show some of their playbook, or I think they're probably working on things. They know they're good at RPOs, and they're not concerned about their ability to get those going in game situations, so they're trying other things. And that's one of the things, too, if I get in preseason, I've always taken it with a grain of salt, because teams are usually trying to do things they're not very good at. They're trying to make sure they shore up areas where they need help rather than areas where they know they're already good. So take it with a bit of a grain of salt.
All right, we're talking with KC Joyner, ESPN.com senior NFL insider, here on the Sports Bash, 97.3 ESPN. Hey, one thing is the Eagles' defense looks pretty darn good. They didn't give up a point in that game. But do you think, Casey, forget what we saw last night, just in general, personnel-wise, do you think this Eagles' defense is going to be better than the defense that won the Super Bowl last year, even though, hey, the Super Bowl wasn't their best game of the season? They had a very good defensive team. Michael Bennett, Jordan Hicks, getting Sidney Jones, Haloti Ngata. Do you think the Eagles' defense is actually better than the team that won the Super Bowl last year?
I think they decided the big thing wanted to do was shore up the front seven to make sure, as we've talked in the past, one of the things they had a problem with last year is that they did a very good job in a metric I have called good blocking rate allowed, how often they allowed the offense, their opposing offense, to get quality run blocking. It's really important, because though if you force the offense to have bad run blocking, they're only going to get probably 2 to 3 yards per play at most. So they really, you have to have a good run blocking offense to get anything going. So they were good at that. But when the offense did get quality run blocking, they allowed nearly 10 yards per attempt, which is one of the highest numbers in the league. So they want to make sure that not only are we winning our point of attack blocks and doing the things to disrupt rushing attacks, so that we make sure we're not allowing big gainers. And I think that getting the improvements that they have in the front seven are going to help them. Plus, I think their secondary, it's just talent on paper right now, but their secondary could be a lot better than they were last year, and they did a lot of things well last year. And I think that if they're that way, they can commit more of the safety help towards the run, which is one of the things that you could do to try to keep that good blocking yards per attempt down.
Shelton Gibson, you mentioned the wide receiving, Mike Wallace. Shelton Gibson has been very good, but other than that, and last night the kid Carter played very well, but not having Nelson Aguilar, not having Alshon Jeffries, how do you think that will carry over into the regular season? Those guys have essentially not played a lick.
Yeah, that's a really big concern because timing among wide receivers and quarterbacks is a huge factor. And if you can't get out there and even practice, if you're not playing much during the preseason games because they're trying to avoid injuries, I sort of get that. But you want to be out there at least tuning up your timing and things. It's just not going to come back immediately. That's a concern. When I'm heading into week one, if I'm looking at the Eagles and going, that's a problem because, again, Wallace, 2 targets last night, so he's not that integrated in the offense. Gibson, he's probably still going to be the 4 unless they shock the world and drop Gibson and dropped Wallace and kept Gibson. And Aguilar's been banged up, and with Jeffrey. And Jeffrey, there's that whole, is the injury, is it a larger concern? Sounds like it's not, but it could be there. And if he's banged up again to start the season, you get us some of the same problems you did last year. So I'd be worried some about the passing game if I were the Eagles.
KC Joyner's with us here, and obviously that third preseason game. It's the last time we see the regulars the next week. Of course, nobody will be out there, but it seems, KC, that all around the league, that even that third preseason game now, teams are pulling back less and less. The concern about injury is so great. So when you look at these preseason games anymore, it's so hard to read if anything into them anymore, right? I mean, in the past you say, oh, well, this guy – you're more looking at players' production or individual players more so than, you say, well, I want to see the offense come out and look pretty good. Does that even matter anymore?
I don't know that it does, and it is a big change because, as I mentioned back in the day, John Shula made a big push to try to get his teams to win in the preseason because he just thought it set the right tone for the season. And you go back in the day and you can look at, I remember even seeing, date myself really, this is before my time even, but I happened to see one time a preseason game with where Dick Butkus was playing. It was the Bears and the Packers in a preseason game, and he was playing for the Bears, and he's running around like it's the Super Bowl. He's flying around. That's the way they used to play things back then. I still think teams would do better in some ways to try to step up their pace in the preseason for themselves. Yeah, you're going to get the injuries, but you're going to be able to start the season at a higher note. You're not going to be hoping that you're making the adjustment. So I think teams sometimes do make a mistake in not trying to at least play harder during the preseason in some ways. So it's something I would do. But if the other teams are being healthy and things, and they're saving themselves for a 16-game stretch, you're kind of in a tough spot because you don't want to be the team that's banged up heading into, you wore down by the time it gets to week 13. The other teams are fresher.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because, I don't know, I'm sure that you have been watching the Hard Knocks, but the episode where the running backs coach and Todd Haley are both like, yeah, we need these guys practicing. They're in street clothes. We're not good enough. And Hugh Jackson says, I've been in your seat. I know you guys want them, but in my seat, they got to get to week number 1. That's the most important thing, is getting these guys to week number 1. So it seems like that is a tough disconnect between a coordinator and the head coach, where the coordinator is saying, look, I need my best guys out here, and the head coach is saying, well, I need them healthy.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, especially at running back, the running back is a position in a situation where you could say you can have enough depth. Good blocking generally tends to be the differentiator, unless you've got big breakaway backs. If you've got a good crew of running backs, you can still have a good running game, and you could work on that. And the only way you get better, especially in running game and run blocking, is to just get out there and do it. You can't just walk through it. You have to get in there and hit people and such. So I think that teams, they know that they can't. I know that's the thing that blows me off too, is that they know they've got limitations during the season. You can't practice as much as you used to. You can't put on shells as much. You can't go as physical during the season. So why not use your time in the preseason and try and get the most out of it and go ahead and be physical there? Because if you hit the ground running in week 1, maybe later on in the season you can afford to rest a couple players because you're going to have won some games that maybe you're not going to win.
That's a good point. What do you think of Cleveland? You talk about teams playing fast, teams doing things. It looked like Cleveland is trying to do that. I mean, you saw it in the Hard Knocks where Hugh Jackson says, we got to protect our home field. We got to win in this building. And it seemed that last night they were at times trying to maybe go into the regular season with a little different attitude.
I really Cleveland's got a ton of talent. If you look at them on paper, they do have a ton of talent, but they still have big problems on defense. Their metrics last year defensively, it was a train wreck. So even if and they had a lot of the same players they have this year. So yeah, adding talent isn't the only thing you've got to do, but they need really to. I mean, they're in a situation. When I look at them, I think, okay, they're going up against Pittsburgh every year. They lay an egg against Pittsburgh, no matter if Pittsburgh's playing the starters or the backups, and it looks like they're in Cleveland's head. Same thing in Baltimore. So their issues are as much that they need to do like Shula was talking about back in the day, where they need to get out there and establish a certain level of play and start to win to show themselves that they can do it. Because they really, like I said, when they get out on Sundays, a lot of times they look like they're beaten before they get on the field, and they have to change that.
KC Joyner's with us here. What are you doing at quarterback if you're Cleveland? Watching last night, watching Baker Mayfield. I know we talked about quarterbacks in the past, but now that you got a chance to see Baker up against the ones, because he looked good in the first couple games. Last night, it seemed he had a little bit, I don't know, he seemed like he was not quite as crisp.
They brought in Taylor, and if you bring in Taylor and you think he's the guy for this year and you've made your choice, I'm kind of like I'm going to date myself again there. The manager for the Baltimore Orioles back in the day, Earl Weaver, he used to say that when he would go through training camp or go through, in baseball, he would go through spring training, and he would decide what his pitching staff was. And once he decided who his starters were in his pitching staff, he'd basically keep that crew in the whole season because he figured that was the time I'm supposed to decide, and I don't want to make a call. So if I'm Cleveland, and I've already decided that Taylor's my guy, and that's who I'm going to go with. Go ahead and go with him and make Mayfield your backup. But Mayfield, I saw a lot of his college tape. Oklahoma, he's that good. They're in a number. You can pick your metric, you can pick your college tapes. You can look at the competition he played against in big games against weak competition. His performance level doesn't drop off. I'm a big Baker Mayfield fan, so if I were them, I might make Mayfield the starter. But I mean, you've already brought in Taylor, so I think you pretty much have to go with him, and then let Mayfield be the guy after this year.
All right, and then you got a couple of other things that are kind of interesting here. How about Todd Gurley? He's saying, sitting out the preseason, that's everyone's dream. Do you think it behooves a guy like Gurley to play a little bit, or do you think these guys are smart sitting this thing out? And I know you would said, like, hey, some of these units, like the offense, getting it, but if you're a running back, does it make sense not to take a couple extra hits?
Yeah, you really need to take a couple extra. You talk to players, and they talk about playing themselves players used to play themselves into shape in the preseason. They used to, if you go way back in the day, they had to have off-field jobs like working as an insurance salesman or running a restaurant things. Today they don't have to do that, and they stay in better shape. But you talk to players, to get into football shape, because there's something about being in shape, physically, that you can go run a marathon. That's great, but you need to be in football shape and take some hits. And players now start to do that in week one. I still think some teams would be smart to, at least for as much of your roster as you can, maybe you don't leave your starting quarterback out there, but for at least as much of your roster as you can, you try and get them into physical shape heading into the week and get to the football shape in week one. I wouldn't be trying to try to do that later in the year. I know that you want to get there healthy and such, and like Washington, they're missing Darius Geis, and that's going to be a problem for them. But at the same time, the benefit of I might suffer an injury to a player. Okay, you might suffer an injury to a player, but if you get the other players up to speed, then it's a good trade-off. So I think that the NFL would go better to be more physical in the preseason, but I still think they're trending in the other direction.
Yeah, and Gurley, he said it, this is everyone's dream not to do it. We know a lot of these veteran players don't like playing in the preseason, right?
Yeah, and if you've got rookies, you've got players coming in and trying to get on the roster. They want to play, and they want to play hard. They want to be in those situations where they're out there and they're playing like that. Because the more practice time you can get them, the more time on the field that you can get them. They want to be out there. They want to do those things. So maybe some of the Gurley who's got the team made, that's fine. But be in hitting shape early in the season. I know he's going to maybe get 400 touches this year, but still get a little bit in the preseason and be ready for game one. So you're not going in there and getting hit and going, all right. And he knows more about it than I do, but I just still think it's a good idea to get into football shape early on.
Yeah, and there's so many interesting storylines heading into the season with we talked about the Browns, and I'm very intrigued by Josh Gordon and what he'll look like once he gets into that offense. They've already got Landry there. The quarterback situation is a lot better than it's been in the recent past with them at all. You add Josh Gordon to that offense there, and that team really becomes more intriguing.
It does. Although he hasn't put up, I do a lot of fantasy football for ESPN, and looking at his metrics, he hasn't put up great numbers in a few years, even when he's been out there. He hasn't put up the dominant numbers. So if he can play to his talent level, but to have a vertical threat like him, a true somebody who plays to his talent level is a top 5 vertical threat in the league, that's something that offense desperately needs, because Landry's going to do a lot of things underneath. He thinks he's the top receiver in the league, but yeah, he's a dink and dunk receiver, top possession receiver, but there's a lot of value there, and they have other players on their roster who could do things. But if Gordon can tear the top off of defense, it makes all the difference in the world. Although I do worry some about Taylor, because sometimes I think Taylor, I almost would rather see him be like what Deshaun Watson was last year. Deshaun Watson was sometimes taking chances downfield and taking too many chances, but he's at least showing, I'm going to go vertical, I'm going to hit passes over the top and really try and make this a dangerous offense. And I think Taylor, in that Buffalo offense, he started to get more, I'm going to take care of the ball a little bit too much. In Cleveland, I think just psychologically needs to be able to go, we need to be aggressive. And so I'd like to see Taylor be a little more aggressive if Gordon's out there.
Hey, KC Joyner's with us here talking some football. There was an article over at ESPN.com, Bill Barnwell, about Deshaun Watson and Carson Wentz. And coming off the ACL injuries. And I want to get your take on how you see these guys, 2 young guys. Watson was unbelievable last year, 19 touchdowns in, 7 games. The expectations for these 2 guys and their styles of play coming off that kind of injury. What do you see, getting, like Wentz, we don't know if he's going to be ready for week 1. It's kind of pointing towards a direction. Some think he will, some think he won't. But do you think you're going to see these guys change at all?
I don't think Watson's battled a knee injury before, so it's not the first time for him to overcome that. And what he did last year is a lot what he did at Clemson. He still took too many chances. He was next to last in the league. He was last in the league in my bad decision rate metric that measures how often the quarterback makes a mental error that turns into a turnover opportunity. Forced a lot of passes into coverage, but if I'm looking out there and if I've got Watson and I go, all right, I got Hopkins on one side of the field and I got Will Fuller, who had fantastic metrics when he was out there. If he can stay healthy and get 125 targets, and you add that to what Hopkins can do and say 175 targets, that's a really good vertical passing game. Even if you're making a few interceptions, you can trade it off and say, fine, I threw a couple of picks, but look at the production I'm getting. So if I'm him, I don't change a thing, and I don't think he will. With Wentz, with this offense is the sort, I would really worry more about the run-pass options and say, do I want him running the ball so much, especially early on? Do I want to take that out of there? So that may be why they're not doing the RPOs too, to say we don't want to run that offense with him until we know that he's back to full speed, because we don't want to take any chances.
Now, the last time we chatted was we did talk about the NFL helmet rule. There was no calls last night in the Eagles game that I remember anyway. Do you think that they are tweaking this or have tweaked it, and that we will not see it be as much of an issue once we get to week 1?
One of my colleagues, Kevin Seifert, did an analysis, and there have been, I think it's 51 out of 5,000 plays that have had that on there. It's like 1%. So if you translated that out over you'd be talking maybe, because it's 25,000 plays a year, 200. You'd be basically talking 1 hit per game, which, because they can come with the 15-yard penalty is not going to be a big thing, but because they can come with suspensions and such, that's the big thing. But it might not be as prevalent as we all think that it is. And I think the officials are hopefully going to get better at calling things that are not clear-cut violations. I think right now they're taking some borderline calls and making those calls, and that's what the league is probably telling them to do. But I hope as the season goes, they start taking the borderline calls and don't just automatically throw the flag and say, okay, we're going to try and use a little more judgment, which is what we talked about last week, that it's too reliant on the officials' judgment, and they need to give them better lines of demarcation and say, this is a penalty and this is not, because right now I don't think they can clarify it.
KC Joyner's with us here. I saw another article that I think would be of some interest to you, and that's about the analytics in the NFL. I know that you use a lot of analytics and a lot of different metrics to the way you watch and study football, but do you think that player tracking data is going to have a much bigger impact on the league moving forward?
I'm curious to they're doing it already in players and how often they're playing and what their speed is as they get later in the game, and trying to basically measure endurance and measure durability and make sure that the players can play at a full speed. But they're talking about it now that they could do things like say, okay, now you're running a a different type of concept versus this type of defense. You're running different things, and I think it's going to be helpful in that situation. But teams have already been doing that for years. They're already looking at how I can use this concept to attack this defense. To say it could help them do it faster and help them not have to put as much manpower into it. But I don't think that's going to start having as big of an impact as it could have until they start to allow these teams to do these things during games. If they can start looking at information like that live during a game and start getting that kind of information, that could dramatically change the way that teams call plays. But I don't know that we're at that point yet. So I think it's going to help, but right now it's just probably going to save them man hours too. I have to put that information together.
KC Joyner, ESPN senior NFL and fantasy football insider since 2005, and tell everybody about the 2018 Football Scientist Draft Guide, which is now up and updated, and what that includes for everybody, because this is the big fantasy football draft week.
It is. One thing I'd like to highlight from a fantasy football perspective is this year ESPN has in our rankings, we have non-PPR and PPR rankings on the site, and for the first time ever, my rankings will actually be on ESPN.com, so people want to go look at in a non-PPR perspective. I'm not doing PPR just yet, but they can go to the ESPN, both ESPN.com and the ESPN app, and they can look for my non-PPR rankings, which are just updated as of Wednesday morning. So you're talking some fresh and updated metrics, and I've got a few players ranked higher than others. I'll mention one is Keelan Cole for the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's getting the starting reps opposite of Marquise Lee, and given how favorable the Jaguars' passing game is this year, I think that he could actually be a wide receiver 4 in fantasy football, and he's not being drafted that way. You can probably get him as a 6th round of waiver wire at the end of a draft, so he's a guy I think that it could be a really high-value player.
All right, and we will, of course, have all the football all season long right here on the Sports Bash, ESPN.com, senior NFL insider here, KC Joyner, with us on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Thanks, pal. Enjoy the rest of the weekend.
Hey, appreciate you too, man.